In the last episode, we talked about the gaps that founders, leaders, and families, builders often face between success and what comes next. Very personal gaps, next chapter gaps. Those gaps matter because they help us name what's happening inside of us when life changes seasons. But there's another side to the gap conversation, another part of the gap map. Some gaps are not only personal, they're structural. And so we want to start thinking about how those gaps affect us because they don't just affect us, they affect the people around us, they affect the systems that we've built over time and put in place. And these gaps, the hardest gaps, they show up when responsibility has to move from one person to another. Who else is expected to carry what I built? Who comes next in the line of succession? Are they ready? Do they have authority? Have we had the right unaccustomed conversations and have they become custom? What happens if the person is quietly holding too much for them to carry? So the goal here is not to transfer the pressure. The goal is to prepare the people to carry it forward. And so, with that, I'm Garrick Francis. This is the Inheritance to Income podcast. We help families, founders, and leaders develop people and systems, not just assets, for what comes next. Because what you build only becomes legacy when people are prepared to carry it. So today we want to continue in our discussion of what gap are you in? We really want to talk about people and system gaps today. What are those things that we recognize around us that we have a heavy influence on, whether it's our founder gravity or whether it's something else that we have to deal with? And just as a reminder, just to kind of to reset the table, remember when we talked about, well, if you didn't, we'll put the link in the show notes to the other episode, the trigger. A trigger or recognition event that gets your attention. It may not be the gap, but it's something that causes you to pause. Something that shakes you a little bit and makes you realize that everything's not the same. And that trigger can be planned, or as we'll talk about today, it can be unplanned. But the deeper question is, what does the gap reveal? In this episode, the trigger often reveals that the system depended on just one person. You. One relationship. One rhythm. One unspoken assumption more than anyone realized. And so you have to think about that. And some of those examples are a successor is named and you have to move forward. A parent needs care that was unplanned for. Key employees decide to leave and take other opportunities. A business partner suddenly passes away. A child moves into the business and wants more responsibility, and conflict erupts, whether it's over property or care or ownership or even authority. And so we want to delve into those gaps. And the first gap is the succession readiness gap, because succession does not guarantee readiness. This is the gap between who is expected to carry the responsibility and if they've been prepared to carry it. And are they ready? Families and businesses often confuse selection and succession with readiness. Back in the olden days, it was the oldest always took over the family name. But were they ready? Were they prepared? Naming a successor does not mean that a person has been adequately prepared to carry forward. Succession is not a moment. Readiness is developed over time. You have to put in place the systems and the practices that make sure that you're developing your people, your family, others to carry what you and those around you have built over time. And so that's really the succession readiness gap. And some of the signs you might want to look for. A successor has been named, but the founder still holds the decisions, signs the checks. Adult children are expected to carry responsibility, but have they been taught the story, the values, the expectations around the family boardroom. A name on an org chart is not the same as readiness. Key knowledge still lives in just one person's head. Everyone says they'll figure it out, or no one has tested that readiness. Again, success does not mean succession, and that doesn't mean readiness. The plan names who is next, but how are they being prepared? That's what is really got you up at night. This got you wondering if you're in that succession gap, if the company, the business, the office, the organization, the church, the team is ready for what comes next. And so the other things that you have to look for here is that, when you're starting to talk about this gap, is that proximity is not preparation. Just because someone's been close doesn't mean someone is capable. And so there's a readiness assessment that needs to take place to make clear decisions. You're being near the responsibility is not the same as being developed for it. A successor can be loyal and gifted and willing and still not ready. So if you think that you're being touched by the succession gap, the goal is not to stop, pretending that preparation has happened or that it's happened by osmosis. You have to plan this one. You have to think about what are the things and the steps you have to take. This takes honest conversation about capabilities and desire and timing and expectations. That's what happens when you're kept up at night by the succession gap. There's the authority gap, and that's the gap between responsibility and authority. Who is being asked to carry something, and do they have the authority to lead? Do the people around you recognize that authority? Has that authority been transferred in the proper way? This often looks like a people problem in a company, but underneath it's really a decision rights problem. Have you established the decision rights process to know who will take over when the time comes? People are held responsible for outcomes, but they don't have the power or the permission or the clarity to influence them. Some of the signs in the authority gap are the successor is expected to lead, but the founder still steps in. Adult children tend to manage their parents' care, but siblings second guess every move. You've got the responsibility without the authority, and that's a setup for a lot of frustration. Spouses are responsible for continuity, but they don't get the key information they need to help make those decisions. And so that authority is being guessed. And authority shouldn't be a guessing game. It should be clarified. This is where you really want to think about, have we been really dealing with, doubt, fear, and worry? And how do we get to direction, clarity, and alignment? Another sign, people often say, hey, step up, or somebody will step up. But no one's clarified that level of authority that comes with stepping up. Someone's been given a title, but a title without the authority is not leadership. That's just pressure with a nameplate. That's just somebody being told, you've got the title, now step up. And so you have to have a system in place that helps to build and hand down trust. Some of the ways will pop up is there'll be tension, and it'll be plain tension. The founder will say they won't step up. The successor says they won't let go. The siblings say you're taking over. The caregiver says I'm doing the work, but everybody has an opinion. The employee says I'm accountable, but I'm not empowered to make those decisions. And so the authority gap recognizes that you don't have clarity with who makes decisions, that you haven't done the authority mapping that could be done to help with some of these challenges, that you've not been given explicit permission to make the decisions, to move forward, to grow the business, to change the organization, to guide the family through a trying time. There needs to be clear boundaries and clear roles. And if you're recognizing that that's not happening, You might be in the authority gap. There needs to be founder restraint, and there needs to be family agreement where it's appropriate and necessary. And so let me take a second to say, if this conversation is already helping you see a place where responsibility and authority and readiness may be out of alignment, share it with someone who needs to also recognize, what gap am I in? And if the Inheritance to Income podcast is helping you think differently about legacy and stewardship and responsibility and generational readiness and what comes next, hit that like and subscribe button so you can join us for more conversations. It helps these conversations to reach more founders, more leaders, more builders and families before that pressure becomes a crisis. Sometimes the language is the first step we use towards these courageous conversations. I'd also like to take a second to recognize our sponsor. Inheritance to Income is brought to you by Reese Francis Studios. Reese Francis Studios helps families and founders and leaders preserve and create stories through photography, videography, and editing. We'll put more information about Reese Francis Studios in the show notes, but if it's important preserving, you should reach out. Now, back to thinking about the gap map. The next one is the relationship gap. And the relationship gap is that gap between those who supported you in this season and those who will support you in the next season. Who belongs in the next chapter? And what conversations are well overdue? What relationships need to be mended? What new relationships do you need to establish and reach out for? And yes, what relationships need to be sunsetted? When your responsibilities begin to change, your relationships have to change too. This is a hard gap sometimes to admit. Many families and businesses let these seasons of change come on them and overrun them without changing the conversation, without changing the relationships and the guidance and the people you have. The kitchen cabinet you had when you founded your business is not the same kitchen cabinet you're going to have when you step into your next assignment. Some people may stay the same, but their roles may change. The relationships may change. People come into our lives for reasons and seasons, and we have to be okay with that. And we have to think about, am I in a relationship gap? Are there relationships that I need to address? It may be that there are signs that are just kind of picking at you. Adult children are still treated like children while they're expected to carry adult responsibility and adult roles. The founder treats the successor like an assistant, not a leader, not the next person who's going to carry the vision forward. Spouses have different visions for the next chapter, but you haven't had the unaccustomed conversation. You haven't sat down to have the conversation about, what does a good day look like 5, 8, 10 years from today? Everyone wants peace, so everyone avoids the conversation that would create clarity. If you're sitting thinking, why haven't we talked about this? You may have a relationship gap. And avoidance can really look like, avoidance can wear the costume of peace. Silence can seem like peace until a crisis arises. In some families, they don't have a relationship problem first. They have an overdue conversation problem. They have to have those conversations. We talk about having those 12 legacy building conversations, the ones that every family should start. Because as I've mentioned before, love is not a plan. Love is motivation. Love is inspiration. And silence isn't clarity. This is when you have to recognize those gaps in your relationships. And wisdom often says, we love each other, but that's not the same thing as we understand what each of us is carrying right now. And sometimes families will continue to avoid these conversations just to protect that peace. A child really wants to become the adult, but they're still in that old role. And if relationships don't mature with the season, it can really sabotage transition. You have to have those conversations about role clarity and expectation setting and a number of other things, those unaccustomed conversations we talk about. We really urge you just to pick one and start with that. And then finally, there's what we call the loss gap. And I want to take a minute here to set the frame for the loss gap. The loss gap is exactly what it says. It's a gap created by grief, by absence, by reorientation when you've been knocked off your stride, about after something, or most often someone meaningful, is gone. What changed that I should not rush past? What has to rest? And what does that loss reveal in my life? Loss is different because loss, it rarely travels alone. Loss, it can expose several other gaps at one time. It can expose a readiness gap or an authority gap or relationship gaps. It can expose income and wealth gaps. It can expose knowledge gaps. Loss can bring forward recognition of a deployment gap about the next season. It certainly can reveal a faith and meaning and purpose gap. And loss also can reveal communications gaps. Some of the signs that you might be in a loss gap are some are a little easier. A spouse or a parent or a child, a brother or a sister, a business partner, a mentor, a key person is gone. And life no longer operates the same way. A role, a company has changed all of a sudden, a sale, a health issue, or a community has ended that you were a vital part of. And that loss exposed something. It exposed who knew about finances, who made decisions, who held relationships together, who was the center or the core, and who carried quiet responsibility. The family is grieving, and you have to give yourself time to grieve. We've done an episode on how to manage and mourn at the same time. It's challenging, but in the loss gap, that's something that you recognize. You feel the pressure in the loss gap to move on before honoring what's changed. This one's deeply personal. I recognize that I was in the loss gap. My mother passed away in January of 2023. And I realized after a while that I was in the loss gap. I realized that my routine was changed. Every morning on my way to work, I would call my mother. And we would just have a 10, 15-minute conversation, depending on Washington, D.C. traffic. And just little things about her day or my day. It changed the complexion of how I walked into the office. We sometimes would talk about my environmental meetings that I had coming up. Golf. But it just was a joyous opportunity to show gratitude for my heritage, for my legacy, for where I came from, and for the responsibilities and the amazing woman that my mother was. And when she passed away, it took me a while to realize that I was deeply affected. My daily routine was deeply affected by that loss. And so if you're in the loss gap, you have to remember that this loss is not just absence, it's revelation. It's the loss gap exposes what was quietly holding the system together. It may expose a relationship between siblings that needs to change around inheritance. And you don't have to rush to fill the loss gap. You have to honor what the person meant to you and what that system meant to you. Then pay attention to what it revealed. And some gaps need professional support because they need strategy, they need development, they need counseling. And so if you think that you're in that loss gap, this is a place where you want to reach out to people. You want care and support, grief-aware wisdom. You want trusted people and professional counselors who know how to help. And eventually you want to get what clarity about the loss revealed. Grief is not managed like a project at work. But loss can reveal responsibilities that certainly need clarity. And so when we think about the arc of what we've talked about in this episode, and the gaps, succession readiness asks, who's expected to carry responsibility and are they ready? Authority gap says, who has responsibility without authority? Relationship gap asks, what relationships do I have to build? Who belongs in my next chapter? And what conversations are overdue? And loss, that gap asks, what's changed? And how has it changed me? And what should I not rush past? What should it reveal? And these gaps, they really matter because transition is not just about moving assets and titles and responsibilities. It's about preparing people to carry what you've built and what comes next. And if responsibility moves before the readiness, before that generational readiness, authority and conversations are in place, without those things, pressure follows. And so if one of these gaps names something you're living with or living through, or you think you may be living through, I want you to write this sentence down. The gap I am in is, and then name it. If it's the succession gap or an authority gap, that may be the time for a decision sprint conversation with us. Sometimes the next right step is not a full transition plan yet. It's clarifying what gap am I in, and then looking at what decisions and responsibilities and authorities and readiness issues we have to address first. So we'd be glad to have that conversation with you. Reach out to us at Francis Legacy Bridge Partners. The information is in the show notes. We can help you talk through the decisions, to talk about how your systems are being affected by the gap that you're in. And so a lot of these gaps that we've talked about, they can overlap. A founder may have an identity gap and an authority gap. A family may have a relationship gap and someone in the family a deployment gap. And a loss gap, as we mentioned, can expose several gaps at once. So again, take it one at a time. Figure out which gap is causing the most trouble. Which gap is keeping you up? Which gap has you thinking the most about what comes next? Because you have to remember, what you've built may have started with you, but if it's going to continue beyond you, it can't depend only on you. That means people need to be prepared. Authority needs to be clarified. Relationships need to mature. Conversations need to happen. And when loss exposes what was quietly holding everything together, we need enough wisdom and grace not to rush past what it reveals. So again, the first job is not to fill the gap, it's to name it. Then you can decide what kind of clarity and conversation or support you need, what kind of structure the next season actually requires. Because when you figure out what gap you're in, you can figure out the right pathway to address it. If you don't name it, if you find yourself in the wrong lane, the solution may be a good one, but it might not address your gap. So as I always like to remind you, inheritance may begin by default, but legacy requires design. I thank you for the time you've granted me. I don't take it lightly. God bless.